ended up being one of the most enjoyable relationships I've ever had.
I saw her on a TV show, and I had never seen her before, and I said, that's it. Whoever she is, I'm going to go with it. I'm going to take a chance.
There comes a moment in life, quiet, almost invisible, when a man stops looking forward and begins looking back, not at the awards, not at the fame, but to the people who once held his heart. Robert Redford was admired by millions, desired by many, and surrounded by some of the most remarkable women in Hollywood history. But as the years passed, one question remained: out of all the women he loved, who was the one he never truly forgot? Before we begin, tell me, which Robert Redford film has stayed with you the most over the years? Share it in the comments below. The woman who built his life, Lola Van Wagenen. Long before the cameras, before the red carpets, and before his name carried weight across Hollywood, Robert Redford was simply a young man searching for direction. And standing beside him during those uncertain years was a woman who would shape the very foundation of his life, Lola Van Wagenen. They married in 1958, at a time when nothing about Redford's future was guaranteed. There were no promises of fame, no certainty of success, only ambition, struggle, and the quiet hope of building something meaningful together. Lola was not drawn to Hollywood glamour. She was grounded, intelligent, and deeply committed to creating a stable life. And for Redford, that stability mattered more than anything. Together, they built a family. They experienced the joys of parenthood, but also the heartbreak of loss, something that quietly shaped Redford in ways the public would never fully see. Through it all, Lola remained a constant presence. While his career slowly began to rise, she held the center of his world steady. But as the years passed, something began to shift. Fame has a way of changing not just a person, but the space between two people. As Redford's career grew, so did the demands, the distance, and the quiet pressures that come with a life in the spotlight. The man who once shared everything with Lola was now being pulled into a different world, one filled with expectations neither of them had imagined. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the closeness they once knew began to fade. By the time their marriage ended in 1985, they had shared nearly 3 decades together, a lifetime by any measure. And yet, some part of what they once had already slipped quietly into memory. Still, there are some beginnings that never truly disappear, even when everything else changes. The woman who matched his energy, Jane Fonda. By the time Robert Redford stepped fully into the spotlight of Hollywood, something about him had already begun to change. The uncertainty of youth had faded, replaced by confidence, control, and a quiet magnetism that audiences couldn't quite explain. And during this rising chapter of his life, one woman seemed to meet him on equal ground, Jane Fonda. Their connection was first brought to life in Barefoot in the Park in 1967. On screen, they felt effortless, playful, natural, and completely in sync. There was a rhythm between them that didn't need explanation. Years later, that same energy would return in The Electric Horseman, where their dynamic had matured into something deeper, more reflective. It was no longer just charm, it was understanding. Fonda was not someone who stood quietly beside a man. She was strong, outspoken, and carried her own presence with undeniable force. And perhaps that was what made their connection so compelling. She didn't soften around him, she matched him. To audiences, their chemistry felt real, almost too real. The way they looked at each other, the way their conversations seemed to carry weight beyond the script, it invited a question that was never fully answered. Was there something more? But whatever existed between them seemed to belong to a very specific world. The world of performance, of shared scenes, of creative energy that lived between action and cut. Outside of that space, their lives followed different paths, shaped by different priorities and personal choices. And that is often the quiet truth about certain connections. Some people meet us at exactly the right moment, and yet, They are never meant to stay beyond it. With Jane Fonda, there was no heartbreak, no dramatic ending, no final goodbye that defined them, just a connection that burned brightly within its time, and then gently faded as life moved forward. Because not every powerful connection is meant to become a lasting one. The woman who challenged his depth, Barbra Streisand. By the early 1970s, Robert Redford had reached a level of fame few actors ever experience. He was no longer just admired, he was iconic, but with that success came a different kind of pressure. The expectation to go deeper, to reveal more, to connect in ways that went beyond charm. And during this defining period, one woman entered his world who would challenge him in a completely different way, Barbra Streisand. When they came together for The Way We Were in 1973, something shifted. This was not the light, effortless energy he had shared with others before. This was layered, emotional, and, at times, even uncomfortable. Streisand brought intensity. She asked questions. She pushed boundaries, not just within the story, but within the space between them. Their on-screen relationship carried a kind of realism that audiences could feel. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, and perhaps that was why it resonated so deeply. They represented two very different personalities, his quiet restraint against her emotional openness, and somewhere in that contrast, something powerful emerged. There were moments during filming where their connection felt almost too genuine to be entirely scripted. Conversations extended beyond scenes. Silences carried meaning. And for a time, it seemed as though they understood something in each other that few others could see. But understanding someone is not the same as building a life with them. What they shared was intense, but it belonged to a specific moment, one shaped by creativity, timing, and circumstance. Once that moment passed, so did the closeness that came with it. There was no lasting romance, no continuation beyond that chapter, just a memory of something that felt real while it lasted. And sometimes the connections that challenge us the most are the ones that leave us thinking long after they're gone. The woman from His Changing Years, Sonia Braga. As the years moved forward, Robert Redford began to step into a different phase of his life. The intensity of early fame had softened. The restless energy of youth had given way to something more reflective. He was no longer chasing success. He had already achieved it. Now, the question was quieter, more personal. What comes after everything you once worked for? It was during this period of transition in the 1980s that his name became linked, at times, with Sonia Braga. Braga was a striking presence, confident, graceful, and carrying an international aura that felt different from the traditional Hollywood circle. She represented something new, something outside the familiar patterns that had defined much of Redford's earlier life. Their connection, while never officially confirmed, was often spoken about in quiet industry conversations. But what mattered more than the details was what this moment represented. This was a time when Redford himself was evolving. His focus was shifting away from being just an actor toward becoming a director, a creator, and the founder of something lasting through the Sundance Institute. His life was no longer centered solely around performance. It was expanding into purpose. And in moments like these, relationships often take on a different meaning. They are not always about building a future, but about reflecting who we are becoming. Whatever existed between them seemed to belong to that space, a passing connection during a period of personal transformation. There was no dramatic beginning and no widely known ending. Just a brief alignment of paths during a time when both were moving forward in their own directions. And sometimes, that is all a connection is meant to be. Not every relationship leaves a lasting mark. Some simply arrive, during the years when everything else is changing. The woman of quiet understanding, Lena Olin. By the time the 1990s arrived, Robert Redford was no longer the young man finding his place in Hollywood, nor the rising star navigating fame. He had become something else entirely. a figure of quiet authority, a man who carried experience in the way he spoke, the way he moved, and even in the silences he allowed. It was during this more reflective chapter of his life that he worked alongside Lena Olin in the film Havana in 1990. Olin brought a different kind of presence, subtle, thoughtful, and emotionally layered. She was not loud in her expression, but there was depth in the way she carried herself. And in many ways, that mirrored the man Redford had become. Their connection, at least on screen, was not built on intensity or dramatic gestures, but on something quieter, something that unfolded slowly. There was a softness in their interactions, a sense that both understood the value of restraint. Conversations didn't need to be filled with words. Moments didn't need to be exaggerated. And for audiences, that created a kind of intimacy that felt more real than anything overly dramatic. As with others before, there were whispers, suggestions that the connection between them might have extended beyond the screen. But like much of Redford's personal life, those details were never confirmed, never fully brought into the light. And perhaps that was intentional, because by this stage of his life, Redford had learned something important. Not every meaningful connection needs to be explained, defined, or shared with the world. Some are simply experienced, and then carried quietly. What he shared with Lena Olin, whatever its true nature may have been, belonged to that quieter space, a connection built on understanding, on timing, and on the kind of emotional maturity that only comes with years. But even then, it was not the one that would define him, because some connections are gentle, but not permanent. The woman who brought him peace, Sibylle Szaggars. As time moved forward, life began to slow in a way it never had before for Robert Redford. The noise of Hollywood no longer held the same power. The urgency that once defined his career had softened into something quieter, something more intentional. And it was during this later chapter of his life that he found a different kind of connection with Sibylle Szaggars. Szaggars was not part of the traditional Hollywood world. She was an artist, thoughtful, creative, and deeply connected to nature and expression in a way that mirrored Redford's own evolving values. Their relationship was not built on spotlight or spectacle. It was built on shared calm, on understanding, and on a mutual appreciation for a slower, more meaningful life. They spent their time away from the noise, often surrounded by the landscapes Redford had always loved. Conversations were no longer driven by ambition, but by reflection. There was no need to prove anything anymore, no roles to chase, no expectations to meet. In 2009, they married. It was a quiet union, fitting for a relationship that had never been about public attention. To those who observed them, there was a sense of balance, a partnership that brought stability after decades of change, and in many ways, she gave him something he had been moving toward his entire life: peace. But there is a quiet distinction that often reveals itself only with time. Peace is not always the same as the love that stays with you forever. What Redford found with Sibylle Szaggars was real, steady, and deeply meaningful. It was a companionship built on respect and shared understanding. It was the kind of relationship many people hope to find later in life. But even in that calm, there are memories that remain untouched. Because sometimes the love that defines you comes long before the life that finally settles you. The one woman he truly loved, Lola Van Wagenen. By the time life begins to slow, something else becomes clearer. Not the moments that were loud, not the relationships that were admired, but the ones that quietly shaped who you became. For Robert Redford, that truth did not live in the years of fame or in the connections formed under the bright lights of Hollywood. It lived much earlier, in a time when everything was uncertain and nothing was guaranteed. It lived with Lola Van Wagenen. She was there before the success, before the recognition, before the world began watching his every move. Together, they built a life from the ground up, one shaped by effort, by shared responsibility, and by the quiet determination to create something lasting. She wasn't part of the story that the world celebrated. She was part of the story that made everything else possible. Through struggle, through growth, and through the years that defined him as a man, Lola remained the constant. She saw him not as an icon, but as a person still finding his way. And that kind of understanding leaves a different kind of mark. Yes, their marriage ended. Yes, life carried them in different directions. But some relationships are not measured by how they end, but by how deeply they were lived. Because others came into his life during moments of success, timing, or change. Lola was there during the beginning, the part of life that shapes everything that follows. And sometimes that is the love that stays, not the most visible, not the most talked about, but the one that becomes part of who you are. In a life filled with remarkable women, she was not just one of them. She was the one who remained, even when everything else had moved on. The love that stays. The life of Robert Redford reminds us of something simple, yet deeply human. A man can experience many relationships, many connections, many moments that feel meaningful at the time, but in the quiet reflection of later years, only one love often carries a different weight. Not because it lasted the longest, but because it shaped the person you became. If this story reminded you of a film, a memory, or even a person from your own life, take a moment to share it below. And if you enjoyed timeless stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because some of the most meaningful stories are the ones we remember together.